Hi everyone, welcome to the Bio Edge.
Now, the subject of human races is inevitably a touchy subject, and it's difficult to discuss human races deeply in conceptual terms without risking offending someone. And part of the reason for this is that we really need to separate what we call here at the Bio Edge raciality. That's a new term we've coined, raciality, from the topic of racism. Once one makes this distinction, it's easier to be objective, unemotional, inquisitive, and truly scientific about it. Because racism is essentially a political phenomenon in which attitudes towards race manifest in various political outcomes. Whereas raciality is nothing political. It's simply the concept of a species having different races, and the inquiry into why raciality would occur as a biological phenomenon in the human race. It also seems to occur in other species such as the orca or killer whale. So raciality is not exclusively human, but it is very well illustrated in humans, and it's one of the enduring puzzles of human biology and deserves to be looked at in that spirit, in that it's one of our most interesting and poorly explained biological characteristics as humans. So let's free our minds of any kind of political correctness, and let's just look at raciality as an adaptive phenomenon fundamental to humanity. And let's ask ourselves, well, what could be the function of raciality in survival, in evolution, and in the natural biology of humans? So in taking this kind of view, we are accepting that different races are different at some level, in contrast to the kind of politically correct view today, which is to pretend that human races do not really exist, and that the obvious differences in skin color and facial morphology and so on are all figments that should be banned from science. Now, once one accepts what is really quite obvious, which is that the races really are remarkably different for conspecific populations, then one has to ask, well, how did the races basically come into existence, and why do they persist? Because both are puzzling. For example, it's not possible to believe that the different races of humans arose simply because of the geographical isolation of the different parts of the human distributional range. We know, for example, that right in Africa, where we think that the human race originated in the first place, there have been at least two human races coexisting side by side in Africa for so long that we have no idea how long it's been going on. And we're talking about the Bantu and other Negroid races, and on the one hand, and the Khoi races on the other. Now, these two races, the more numerous Africans today, on the one hand, and the Khoi people on the other, who are found in surviving form only in small numbers, in the form of Khoisan and the derivatives of the Khoi, mainly in southern Africa, with a completely different language group with cliques. These two groups appear to have lived side by side in Africa since time immemorial, and it's not true to say that the Khoi people with their clique languages were some kind of relictual group that were driven into some remote part of Africa as the prevailing African races encroached on their territory. In fact, there's been widespread coexistence, and to this day these people tend to coexist side by side to a remarkable extent, as opposed to interbreeding. We know that the Khoi lived, for example, in the whole Saharan region previously, so they were widespread throughout Africa. And so the basic problem in Africa is that you have two extremely different races of human who apparently both arose in Africa despite competing for the same resources, and who have more or less coexisted in distinct form in Africa since time immemorial. Of course, there's been some interbreeding and some blurring, but the fact that both the Bantu and the Khoi people arose in Africa in the first place is testimony to the reality of raciality in humans. And similar pictures could be drawn elsewhere in Eurasia, for example, where several different racial groups have coexisted over large parts of Eurasia for an extremely long time. Now, if it were true that the human races simply arose because of geographical isolation in the first place, then we would predict that the moment the races came together, they should biologically integrate and be obliterated in a kind of coffee-colored intermediate state. But that hasn't really happened to the degree that races have been expunged. And to this day, races do coexist despite some integration. So there's obviously a biological imperative somewhere in our makeup to make these discriminations biologically and to tend to preserve certain racial lines. Now, if that's true, then there must be some biological advantage to it. And I think the mistake that's been made, and you know, one of the flawed lines of thinking that has tended to get people into trouble in terms of political correctness, is to assume that the biological advantage of raciality is a physical advantage in the same sense that you know, any physical trait has a direct physical adaptive value. What we're suggesting here at the BioEdge is that the obvious physical differences between people don't function physically in the way that they might in a lower animal. What they do is they simply announce the distinctiveness of the population of humans involved. And in that way, they act as a kind of flag to what is truly adaptive in humans, which is the culture. So to walk you through the rationale in a bit more detail, you could have one race that's short, squat, and dark, and another race that is tall and lanky and pale, and they could conceivably live in the same area. And it's very tempting to look for adaptive explanations in the sense of you know, the short, squat, and dark people, you know, perhaps being forest-living, sun-tolerant you know, tree climbers or whatever, and the other group, you know, having a different adaptive profile. But we're saying that's not likely. We're saying that the real reasons for this remarkable morphological divergence between coexisting human populations is that it simply reminds everybody of what are essentially cultural heritages that have specialized in different directions. And so because everybody can recognize the race of a certain human individual, it's far easier to maintain the discrimination that ultimately has adaptive value in terms of preserving and propagating cultural traditions that are the basis of human ecological success in the long term. So that might be a more interesting theory to test than what we've seen in the past, where people have shoehorned races, you know, in terms of skin color, for example, into what are really quite fanciful geographical schemes. I mean, people pretend that the darkest races tend to live in the sunniest places, and the palest races tend to live in the least sunny places, and that's certainly true to some extent. But the exceptions are far too large for us to believe in that as a simple adaptive reason for raciality. For example, the Tasmanian Aboriginals, who lived at a high latitude, a latitude equivalent climatically to Northern Europe, these people were remarkably dark as the tropical Aboriginals in Australia. And in going back to Africa, the Khoi people were far paler than the coexisting Negroid people. And so we find many cases of mismatching. The equatorial people living in Southeast Asia are fairly pale. And it's difficult to see how the darkest races, such as the Nilotes in southern Sudan, are living in an environment that's so much sunnier, that has so much more ultraviolet, that it would explain their extremely dark skin. So we're saying that there's some measure of adaptive value certainly in having more melanin in your skin, in a sunny environment, but that doesn't go nearly halfway to explain the full variation of human skin color in terms of raciality. And that what's really going on, more importantly, is this kind of physical fagging of what are ultimately valuable and valid cultural specializations that are better propagated and preserved if people marry along racial lines. None of this justifies raciality or makes any comment on whether it's good or bad. It simply gives it some kind of biological basis, some kind of hypothetical structure that we can go on and test in a dispassionate way in the interests of understanding our own species, the human race, better than we have in the past, bearing in mind that the bio-edge that we're exploring here at this website actually begins in the mirror. And we, the human race, the human species, are one of the most mysterious biological entities, despite the fact that it is we who are studying ourselves. And with those thoughts, we'll look forward to seeing you next time, and we'll sign off from the bio-edge, and until then, bye.